Hi, Bill here. I'd like to talk about opening traps involving the long diagonal to the king. So when the king's on its starting square, it's intersected by the long diagonal. There aren't as many traps or as deadly traps as on the short diagonal, but nonetheless, there still are some bad things that can happen to white on the long diagonal. So in this case, something bad is happening to black on the long diagonal. So we've got an undefended knight. So the queen moves out to check and wins the knight. So notice with the long diagonal, white has a natural check, queen to a4 or bishop to b5, whereas on the short diagonal, white can check in one move of queen to h5. Though it may be possible black could also be checked on these squares. So this time, white picks up an undefended pawn on e4 with a fork. Now we've got a situation where the long diagonal is blocked by the knight. However, black's got a problem. It's got two loose pieces here. So the queen forks the pieces, and black thinks, I'll move one piece and defend the other. But now white just has a simple move. White attacks the pinned knight with a pawn and wins material. So now we've got a typical situation where the queen pins the knight to the king. We've got two attackers. Now after the exchange, black can move the queen up to pin the knight to the queen. So next move, black can regain the knight. If he didn't do that, we'll back up. If after knight takes knight, if the pawn takes the knight, queen takes pawn check, queen moves up, the queen can win the rook. So another example, queen picks up a loose knight with queen a4 check. Doesn't work in this position though, because after queen check the knight can come back defended by the pawn. So another square, the queen will pick up a loose knight. This time it won't work again because the knight's pawn will defend the knight. So check wins the knight. Now here's another way the knight can be defended. If the black queen's on its home square, black can move the pawn up, blocking the check, and both the pawn and the knight are defended. So black's got a loose bishop, but what happens if white forks it? The bishop can run back. However, if it was a knight instead of a bishop, the queen check attacks the knight, and the knight can't run back, but black has a defence by moving the queen up to defend the knight. So this time though, we've got a loose bishop on g4, but its retreat is blocked by this pawn. So after the queen check, black will lose his bishop. So we've got a knight on the long diagonal. We've got a loose knight here. I mean, maybe white could pin the knight, but the pawn could defend. So white starts with an attack with a pawn. The pawn has the most powerful attack, being the weakest unit. It can't be blocked, and if it attacks anything better than a pawn, it must move if it wants to remain safe. So the pawn attacks the knight. The problem for black is once the knight moves, the queen check will pick up the loose knight on e4. So it is a tricky move, which I once had in a game against the national champion when I was 16, and I failed to play it. I would have just won the exchange and a pawn. So black has just moved to attack the knight. The knight is under attack. White doesn't move the knight, he moves the queen, threatening discovered mate by moving the knight, double check and mate. And if the pawn takes the knight, we've won the exchange. If the bishop moves in the way, thinking to pin the knight to the queen, white has a smothered mate with the knight. Okay, so we've got bishop check is a natural square for the b5 is a natural checking square for the white bishop. There's two potential ways black could block. Okay, so in this case we've got this undefended queen lined up with the white queen, so we give a check, and next move we'll take that queen. And this position looks like black's sort of alright, but after the check, if black hasn't got a knight or a bishop ready to block, all we can do is move the queen up and lose the queen for a bishop. Okay, so I've seen this happen. When the bishop goes to b5, pins the queen to the king, as the bishop is defended by the knight. This is a similar situation, except the bishop won't be directly defended, it'll be indirectly defended. So when the bishop pins the queen to the king, if the queen takes, white does a knight fork and wins the queen. And another example of the bishop pinning the queen. This time the queen's on the d7 square, so bishop pins the queen. If black had a pawn here, he could block, or a knight, he could block. Okay, so here's a tactic I've called the hit and the run. So the black knight looks safe, it's defended twice, but white plays a sneaky manoeuvre. The knight takes the knight, and if the pawn takes the knight, white benefits from this bishop being undefended. The bishop will just take the pawn. But so if the bishop takes with check, the knight does a hit and run, it's knocked off a piece, and it retakes the piece. If we take with the king, black can take the knight, so we retake the bishop, and white has gained a piece. Okay, so this time we're looking at the b5 check with the queen. So after the queen has moved, sometimes we can go to b5 check, and from here it's attacking many different squares, so there's a possibility of a fork. So the queen moves in and forks the king and the undefended bishop. Okay, so here this is undefended, so the queen b5 check goes in, and white will pick up the e-pawn. Now, this time this is undefended, the b-pawn's undefended, so the white queen goes into b5 and picks off the b-pawn. This is a little bit different though, because after the queen b5 check, black has a resource. The queen has moved forward and is defending the b-pawn. Now, black looks safe enough. The knight on d7 is attacked once, defended twice. But the bishop pin is rather killing, because unless black can get a knight or a bishop to defend this knight, he'll lose this knight. A typical situation where the bishop's pinning the knight to the king. There are two attackers and one defender. So after the exchange, white creates a fork with the forking the rook and the king. Black can block, which is discovers in the defence by the queen. The queen now defends the rook, but white has gained the exchange and a pawn. Now this is a dangerous situation for black. Bishop is lined up to the king. We have discovered checks possible. So we take the pawn, we'll check, and next move we'll pick off that rook and turn it into a queen. So this time the pawn doesn't make a capture, it just moves forward, and whatever black does, he's going to lose the queen. So looks like white's checked and the bishop's blocked, but white's got a clever move. He drives the bishop away with the pawn. If the bishop moves, now the pawn will move forward and win the queen. So what do we got here? So we've got a queen attacks the knight. Bishop defends the knight. Queens are lined up, but the knight's in the way. So white checks with the bishop. Now, if the bishop blocks, nothing is defending this knight, because this bishop's pinned, and this knight defends the bishop, so the queen can take the knight, and this exchange doesn't lead anywhere. And the other thing that can happen, after the bishop check, the king might run, but unfortunately for black, because this queen is undefended and lined up with this, all the knight has to do is move out of the way with check. So the knight moves out of the way, creates a knight fork, and next move white will capture this queen. So black takes this, or take this. Okay, so fairly common situation. Bishop pins the knight to the king. So it's an absolute pin, and the pawn can attack it. So pawn attacks it, but there is a sneaky way black can attempt to wriggle out of it. He counterattacks the bishop. So pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop. So you need to have pieces to be able to catch this rogue pawn in that case. Now, if the bishop retreats back to a4, pawn to b5 keeps the attack on the bishop. So this time we've got bishop pinning knight to the king. We've got a pawn here supported by another pawn. So the pawn advances. We've got tempo on the knight. If that knight moves somewhere, the pawn goes one square forward, and great way to attack a pinned piece with a pawn. When a piece can't run away, you attack it with a pawn, and as they say, pin it and win it. So now we've got a situation where it looks like white's grabbed the knight's pawn, attacking the rook in the corner. The bishop's moved up to defend the rook with an X-ray. So white's got a sneaky move here. Moves the bishop, pinning the black bishop to the king. It's a partial pin, so this bishop can move back or take the bishop. But unfortunately for black, it means this rook is going to fall. So say if black moves defending the bishop, hoping to save the rook, bishop takes the bishop, queen takes the bishop. Now he's defending the rook from behind with an X-ray, and the queen is defended by the knight. But the white queen slips in and makes mate. Okay, now we've got a fairly typical situation. Bishop is pinning the knight to the queen. The king and the queen are all lined up. Knight moves in, hitting the queen, intensifying the attack on the knight. So if the queen moves up one, the only square where you can keep the defense of the knight, the queen's on the line of the defended bishop. So knight takes knight, gains material. Black hasn't got time to take the knight with a pawn because the queen's hanging. Okay, similar sort of thing. So bishop pins the knight to the king. Pawn defends the knight. But when we swing the knight in, it hits the knight and the bishop. So it's a fork, and this bishop can't run back to d7 because the pawn is in the way. So white gains material. So here, this is a beauty because the white queen attacks the rook, but it's defended. So white has a finesse. The queen slips into a check. And if the queen moves up, well, it has to. It's a forced move. White gets a free rook. So here we've got, it looks like the greedy black queen has grabbed a pawn on d4. It's defended by the knight. Queen attacks the queen. Knight defends the queen. But the bishop goes with check. So white uses the long diagonal to win the queen. Okay, so it looks like the greedy knight has grabbed a pawn this time. So the knight takes the knight, queen takes the knight. Now black has an undefended queen lined up on the queen. Bishop moves out of the way with check, and white will win this queen. So this time similar. So the greedy knight's grabbed the pawn, knight takes the knight, queen takes the knight. Now instead of going bishop there, check, mainly because it's not check, the bishop goes to a different square, gives check and wins the queen. So it comes to the same thing. Now this is a bit different, and it's not really on the long diagonal. It's really on. But anyway, so looks like what's going to happen is white going to win material. White grabs the knight. The queen grabs the knight. Bishop checks. Pawn takes the bishop. Queen takes queen. And it looks like white has won a queen for a bishop. But white now has a counterattack owing to the fact that when the pawn took the bishop, the rook was opened up. And the bishop's attacking this pawn as well. So now black launches his counterattack. Bishop takes the pawn check, forces the king into the corner. Bishop comes out check, because black has to discover check. It's like having two moves in a row with the bishop. And now, next move, black picks off the queen. So this is a case of the trapper being trapped. Okay, so now what have we got here? So it looks like we could play queen takes knight, but we'll lose our knight. But there's a way white can gain material. So it looks like the knight's pinned, but it's only a relative pin. So sometimes you can move the piece and create some kind of good sacrifice. So the knight takes the knight. Black thinks, aha, I've won the queen. But now the bishop gives check. And it's one of these cases where the queen is forced to block. And black will lose his queen. Okay, so now it's white's move again. Okay, so similar situation. Black has a knight here defending d7, but it's not going to help because after knight takes knight, sacrificing the queen. Bishop takes the queen. Bishop goes check. Knight blocks and check. It turns out black has to lose his queen. Queen takes bishop, knight takes queen. Okay, so now that's the end of the section. So that was just some of the patterns behind the opening traps on the long diagonal. So there will be a collection of short games involving those traps, as well as other traps. So thank you for watching.